In the unforgiving desert of the Arizona Territory, Eli Thorne lay dying beneath a merciless sun. The cowboy had ridden 3 days without food, carrying a message that could change everything when his body finally surrendered to exhaustion and hunger. As consciousness slipped away, he accepted his fate. This was how his story would end. But fate had different plans. When Eli's eyes opened again, a magnificent white stallion stood over him, its dark eyes holding an intelligence that seemed almost human. The horse nudged him gently, refusing to leave. As Eli struggled to his feet, the stallion began leading him through the desert with purpose and understanding no wild horse should possess. What was this creature and why had it chosen to save him? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks earlier, the sun had risen over Redemption Springs with the same indifferent warmth it always did, painting the weathered buildings in shades of amber and dust. Eli Thorne stood in the stable doorway, rolling his shoulders against the stiffness that came with sleeping on hay bales. At 52, his body reminded him every morning of the years spent in the saddle, of the countless miles ridden when he'd been somebody worth remembering. He ran a calloused hand through his grey-streaked hair and looked down at the tarnished silver compass in his palm. His father had given it to him 40 years ago, back when Eli had first signed on with the Pony Express. "This will always point you home, son," his father had said. But the compass needle spun aimlessly now, broken for the past decade, unable to find true north, much like Eli himself. The stable smelled of horses and leather, familiar scents that brought him comfort even as they reminded him of what he'd lost. He'd once owned 3 fine horses, a small ranch, and the respect that came with being one of the fastest riders on the frontier. Now he owned nothing but the clothes on his back, a broken compass, and memories that weighed heavier than any saddlebag. "Morning, Eli." The voice belonged to Tom Haskins, who owned the stable. The man appeared in the doorway, his expression a mixture of kindness and pity that Eli had grown accustomed to. "Got the stalls cleaned already?" "Yes, sir. All 6 of them." Eli pocketed the compass and straightened his spine, maintaining what dignity he could. "Fed and watered the horses, too." "Good man." Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out $2 silver. "That's for the week's work." Eli took the coins, knowing they represented charity as much as payment. The work he did was worth maybe half that, but Tom was generous to those who'd fallen on hard times. "Appreciate it. Sarah Brennan's looking for someone to stack supply crates at the general store. Might be worth your while to stop by." Tom's voice was gentle, the way one speaks to a man whose pride is fragile. Eli nodded his thanks and stepped out into the morning light. Redemption Springs was waking up around him. The blacksmith's hammer rang against his anvil. Women swept the boardwalks in front of their shops. Children chased each other through the dusty street, their laughter cutting through the measured pace of adult life. This town had been good to him, even after everything fell apart. The general store sat on the corner of Main Street, its false front painted white, though the desert sun had faded it to cream. Through the window, Eli could see Sarah Brennan arranging canned goods on shelves. She moved with practiced efficiency, her dark hair pulled back in a simple bun, her dress plain but clean. She'd been widowed 3 years ago, when her husband took sick with pneumonia. And like Eli, she'd managed to hold onto her dignity and her business. The bell above the door chimed as he entered. Sarah looked up and smiled, a genuine expression that made him remember there was still kindness in the world. "Mr. Thorne, Tom sent you over?" "Yes, ma'am." "Heard you might need some help with crates." "I do indeed." She gestured toward the back room where wooden crates were stacked haphazardly. "New shipment came in yesterday. Need them organized, and the heavier ones moved to the top shelves. My back isn't what it used to be." Eli removed his hat and set it on the counter. "I'll take care of it." "There's coffee on the stove," she said. "Help yourself." He worked steadily through the morning, his muscles remembering the rhythm of physical labor. The crates contained everything from bolts of fabric to farming tools, the lifeblood of a frontier town. As he worked, He listened to Sarah conducting business with the steady stream of customers. She knew everyone by name, asked about their families, extended credit to those who needed it. She ran her store the way his father had taught him to live, with fairness and compassion. Around noon, she brought him a plate of bread and cheese. "You haven't eaten yet." "I'm fine, ma'am." "Eli Thorne, sit down and eat." "I won't have a man fainting in my storeroom." Her tone left no room for argument. He sat on an upturned crate and accepted the food, trying not to eat too quickly despite his hunger. Sarah pulled up another crate and sat across from him, her own plate in hand. "The town council met last night," she said, her voice dropping. "There's talk of the railroad coming through. Some folks are excited, but others are worried." "Worried about what?" "Land disputes," Sarah said quietly. "Vernon Cross has been buying up properties west of here. Folks say he's trying to control the water rights before the railroad arrives. If he succeeds, he'll own half the county." Eli had heard the name before. Vernon Cross was a cattle baron who'd built his empire through ruthlessness and legal maneuvering. Men like him saw the frontier not as home, but as opportunity, something to be exploited and controlled. "Nothing we can do about men like that," Eli said, the bitterness in his voice surprising even himself. "They always win." Sarah studied him with those steady brown eyes. "You didn't always think that way." He looked down at his plate. She was right. 20 years ago, he would have fought against injustice. He would have believed that one man with courage could make a difference. But that was before his wife left him, before his daughter stopped writing, before he'd drunk away his ranch and his reputation. Age and failure had taught him that some battles weren't worth fighting because they couldn't be won. 20 years changes a man, he said. It doesn't have to break him. Sarah stood and collected their plates. "You're a good man, Eli Thorne. I wish you could see that." He returned to work, her words echoing in his mind. The afternoon passed in comfortable silence, broken only by the sounds of commerce and conversation from the front room. When the last crate was stacked and organized, Sarah paid him $3, twice what the work was worth. "That's too much," he protested. "It's what the job pays." Her tone brooked no argument. "Same time next week if you want it." "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you." Walking back through town, Eli passed the telegraph office and paused. Through the window, he could see the operator sorting messages. For a moment, he considered sending a wire to his daughter Margaret. She lived in Philadelphia now, married to a banker, living the kind of respectable life he'd never been able to provide. The last letter he'd received from her was 6 years ago, shortly after her wedding. She'd written that she needed time to build her new life, that perhaps it was best if they didn't correspond for a while. He'd honored that request, understanding that he was an embarrassment to her, a reminder of frontier roughness that didn't fit into her refined Eastern world. He walked on, the moment passing. What would he even say to her? That he was still alive, still failing, still the same disappointment he'd always been. The sun was setting when he returned to the stable. Tom had already left for the day, but he'd left the side door unlocked, as he always did. Eli climbed to the hayloft where he'd made his bed and sat looking out the small window at the darkening sky. Stars were beginning to emerge, those same constant points of light that had guided him through countless nights on the trail. He pulled out the broken compass again, holding it up to catch the last rays of sunlight. The needle trembled but found no direction. His father had been wrong. The compass couldn't point him home because Eli had no home left to find. He'd sold the ranch to pay debts he'd accumulated during his drinking years. His wife had taken their daughter and moved back east, filing for divorce through a lawyer. He'd signed the papers without contest, knowing he had nothing to offer them but more disappointment. The memories came unbidden, as they often did in the quiet evening hours. He remembered teaching Margaret to ride when she was 5, her delighted laughter as he led the gentle mare in circles around the corral. He remembered his wife Elizabeth's face on their wedding day, full of hope and love. He remembered the pride he'd felt carrying mail across dangerous territory, knowing that the letters in his saddlebag might be the only connection some frontier families had to the world beyond. Where had that man gone? When had the proud rider become the broken stable hand? He lay back on the hay, his body aching from the day's labor. Tomorrow would be the same as today. He'd wake stiff and sore, clean the stalls, accept whatever work was offered, and go to sleep with an empty stomach and a hollow heart. This was his life now, and he'd accepted it with the same resignation he'd accepted everything else. But something stirred in him as he drifted towards sleep, some ember of his former self that refused to be completely extinguished. He dreamed of riding again, of purpose and direction, of a compass needle that pointed true. He dreamed of being the man his father had believed he could be. The following morning arrived with a commotion that shattered the usual peaceful dawn. Eli woke to the sound of horses and shouting voices in the street. He climbed down from the loft and stepped outside to find a crowd gathering near the doctor's office. The tension in the air was palpable, the kind that precedes bad news or violence. "What's happened?" he asked a young boy running past. "Ryder came in shot up. They're saying he's dying." Eli's heart quickened. The instinct of his old profession kicked in immediately. A wounded rider meant urgent news, the kind that couldn't wait for regular mail service. He pushed through the gathering crowd to the doctor's office, where Sheriff Bill Clayton stood guard at the door. "I can't let anyone in, Eli. Doctor's orders. I might know him. I rode for the Express for 15 years. The sheriff hesitated, then nodded. "Make it quick." Inside, the small office smelled of blood and antiseptic. Dr. Morrison worked frantically over a man lying on the examination table. Even from the doorway, Eli could see the man was in bad shape. 2 bullet wounds, one in his side and one in his shoulder. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, but Eli recognized him immediately. Samuel Webb. They'd ridden together during the final years of the Pony Express before the telegraph lines made their profession obsolete. Samuel had been younger then, full of ambition and courage. Now his weathered face told stories of hard years and harder choices. "Samuel," Eli said, moving closer. "It's Eli Thorne." The wounded man's eyes flickered open. Recognition dawned in them, followed by something that looked like relief. "Eli, thank God. Thought I wouldn't make it." "Don't talk," Dr. Morrison said. "Save your strength." But Samuel reached out with a trembling hand, grasping Eli's sleeve with surprising strength. "No time, have to tell you." He coughed, blood flecking his lips. "The message. In my saddlebag. Has to reach Fort Halloran." "The doctor needs to work on you," Eli said, but Samuel's grip tightened. "They'll kill anyone who carries it. That's why they shot me. But you, Eli, you know the trails. You know how to disappear when you need to." Another cough, weaker this time. 5 days. Message has to arrive in 5 days, or people will die. Good people, families. Sheriff Clayton stepped forward, his face grave. "What kind of message are we talking about, Sam?" "Water rights. Vernon Cross is hoarding. Drought's coming and 3 settlements will dry up if someone doesn't stop him. The information in that letter proves what he's doing. Proves it legal and proper." Samuel's voice was fading. "Fort Halloran can enforce federal water law, but only if they know." The doctor shook his head. "I need to operate now, or he won't make it another hour." Samuel pulled Eli closer, his eyes desperate. "Please remember when we rode together? Remember what we stood for? Getting the mail through no matter what. This is more important than any mail we ever carried. This is lives, Eli. Children's lives." Eli felt the weight of those words settle on his shoulders. He looked at Samuel's face, saw the plea there, the trust. This man believed in him, believed he was still the rider he'd been 20 years ago. "I'll do it," Eli heard himself say. "I'll get your message to Fort Halloran." Relief washed over Samuel's features. "Saddlebag. Sealed leather pouch. Don't open it. Just deliver it to Commander Price. He'll know what to do." His hand fell away. "Tell him Samuel Webb sent you. Tell him the old codes." The doctor pushed Eli aside. "Out now. I have to work." Eli stepped back into the street where the crowd had grown larger. Sheriff Clayton followed him out, his expression troubled. "This is dangerous business, Eli. Vernon Cross has men everywhere. If what Samuel says is true, they'll be hunting for that message. Then I'd better get moving. You haven't ridden distance in years, and you don't even have a horse. I'll borrow one from Tom. He owes me a favor." The sheriff studied him for a long moment. "You sure about this? You're not the young hotshot you used to be. No offense meant. None taken, but Samuel's right. Someone has to do it, and I know the territory. I know how to move fast and quiet. Eli met the sheriff's eyes. Besides, what else am I doing with my life? Cleaning stables until I'm too old to lift a pitchfork. Clayton nodded slowly. Samuel's horse is at the livery. Get the saddlebag there. And Eli, be careful. Cross doesn't leave witnesses. Eli found the saddlebag exactly where Samuel said it would be. The leather pouch inside was sealed with wax, stamped with symbols he didn't recognize. He tucked it carefully into his own weathered satchel and headed to the general store. If he was going to make this journey, he'd need supplies, and he had exactly $5 to his name. Sarah looked up when he entered, her smile fading as she saw his expression. You heard about the wounded rider? I knew him. Rode with him years ago. Eli set his money on the counter. I need to buy supplies. Whatever this will get me. Where are you going? Fort Halloran. 5 days hard riding. Sarah's eyes widened. Eli, that's through some of the worst desert territory. And if you're carrying whatever that rider brought, you'll have dangerous men after you. I know. Then why would you do this? You don't owe anyone anything. He was quiet for a moment, trying to find words for something he barely understood himself. Maybe that's exactly why I need to do it. Because I don't owe anyone anything means I haven't mattered to anyone in a long time. This matters. Those settlements Samuel mentioned, they have families, children. If I can help them, if I can do this one thing right, then maybe the last 20 years won't have been completely wasted. Sarah's expression softened. She came around the counter and began pulling items from the shelves. Hardtack, dried meat, coffee, matches, a new canteen. She packed them efficiently into a canvas bag, adding far more than $5 would buy. Sarah, I can't afford all that. Consider it a loan. Pay me back when you return. She met his eyes. And you will return, Eli Thorne. I expect to see you back here in 2 weeks, alive and whole. Yes, ma'am. She added one more item to the bag, a small wrapped package. Chocolate. For when the trail gets hard and you need reminding that there are still sweet things in the world. He felt something catch in his throat. Thank you. You're a good man. Don't let anyone tell you different. Not even yourself. Tom Haskins was more reluctant to part with a horse, but he eventually agreed to lend Eli a sturdy mare named Bess. She was older, steady, not built for speed, but reliable. Eli saddled her carefully, checking every strap and buckle with the practiced hands of his former profession. The sun was climbing toward noon when he finally rode out of Redemption Springs. A small crowd had gathered to see him off. Sarah stood at the front, her hand raised in farewell. Sheriff Clayton nodded his respect. Even Tom Haskins looked impressed, as if seeing Eli in the saddle had reminded him of the man Eli used to be. As the town disappeared behind him, Eli felt something he hadn't experienced in years: purpose. His body remembered the rhythm of long-distance riding, the way to move with the horse rather than against it. The broken compass in his pocket pressed against his chest, a reminder of direction lost and perhaps, just perhaps, direction that might be found again. The trail ahead was dangerous. He knew the desert between here and Fort Halloran intimately, knew its beauty and its cruelty. Men had died on these trails, their bones picked clean by vultures and scattered by wind. If Vernon Cross's men caught him, they'd kill him without hesitation. The message in his saddlebag was worth more than one old cowboy's life. But Samuel had trusted him. Sarah believed in him. And somewhere deep inside, beneath years of failure and resignation, Eli wanted to believe in himself again. He wanted to prove that the man who'd ridden for the Pony Express, who'd carried messages through blizzards and raids, who'd once been called the most reliable rider on the western routes, was still alive inside this weathered shell. The desert stretched before him, vast and unforgiving. The sun beat down with relentless heat. Bess moved steadily beneath him, her hooves finding purchase on the rocky trail. Eli adjusted his hat, checked his position by the sun, and settled in for the long ride. He thought of his daughter Margaret, wondered what she would think if she knew what he was doing. Would she be proud? Would she care? Or had he lost the right to her emotions years ago when he'd chosen whiskey over responsibility? It didn't matter now. This journey wasn't about redemption in her eyes. It was about finding some measure of redemption in his own. Samuel was dying, possibly already dead. But his message would reach Fort Halloran. Eli Thorne would make sure of it, or he'd die trying. At least then, his death would mean something. At least then, he'd have mattered one last time. The first day passed without incident. Eli rode steadily through familiar territory, following trails he'd ridden countless times in his youth. The landscape changed gradually from scrubland to rocky hills, the vegetation thinning as the elevation rose. Bess proved herself a reliable mount, maintaining a steady pace without complaint. By nightfall, they'd covered nearly 30 miles. Eli made camp in a shallow canyon, building a small fire from dried mesquite. The night air turned cold quickly, as it always did in the desert. He ate sparingly from Sarah's supplies, knowing he needed to ration carefully for the journey ahead. The stars emerged in their thousands, a vast dome of light that made him feel both insignificant and connected to something larger than himself. He pulled out the blood-stained letter, studying it without breaking the seal. Samuel's blood had dried on the leather, a dark reminder of what this message had already cost. Inside was information that could save families, children who would grow up with water to drink and crops to harvest. Or it was just paper and ink, meaningless if it didn't reach its destination. The weight of responsibility pressed on him. He wasn't the man for this job. He was broken, unreliable, a shadow of his former self. But he was the man Samuel had chosen, and he wouldn't let his old friend down. Not this time. Sleep came fitfully. He woke several times during the night, alert to every sound. The desert was never truly silent. Coyotes called to each other in the distance. The wind whispered through rocks. Small creatures rustled in the darkness, hunting or being hunted. Each sound could be natural, or it could be men tracking him. He wouldn't know until it was too late. The second day was harder. The terrain grew more challenging, the trail steeper and rockier. Bess picked her way carefully over loose stones. Her breathing labored in the climbing heat. Eli rationed the water carefully, giving Bess most of what they had. A rider without a horse was a dead man in this country. By afternoon, they crested a ridge, and Eli could see the vast expanse of desert stretching before them. The true wasteland. Miles of sand and rock with little vegetation and less water. He'd crossed it before, but always with fresh supplies and a strong horse. Bess was already tired, and they were only 2 days into the journey. He considered turning back. The smart thing would be to return to Redemption Springs, explain to the sheriff that he wasn't up to the task, let someone younger and stronger take the message. But he knew there was no one else. Samuel had been shot precisely because Cross's men knew about the message. They'd be watching anyone who left town. Eli had slipped out before they could organize, but anyone following now would ride straight into an ambush. No, this was his burden to carry. He'd accepted it, and he'd see it through or die in the attempt. They descended into the desert as the sun began its downward arc. The heat was oppressive, shimmering off the sand in waves that distorted the horizon. Eli wrapped a cloth around his face to keep from breathing the dust that Bess's hooves kicked up. His lips were already cracking, despite his careful sips from the canteen. The second night's camp was in the open, no shelter to be found. He didn't risk a fire. The darkness was absolute, broken only by starlight. Eli lay on his bedroll, every muscle aching, and wondered how long he could keep this pace. 3 more days to Fort Halloran. 3 more days of heat and thirst and the constant fear of pursuit. He thought about Samuel Webb's face as he lay dying. The trust in those eyes, the desperate hope that Eli would succeed where Samuel had failed. How many men had Samuel trusted in his life? How many had let him down? Eli couldn't bear to be added to that list, even if Samuel never knew whether he'd succeeded or failed. The broken compass was a hard lump against his chest as he lay there. He pulled it out, holding it up to the starlight. The needle spun uselessly, finding no direction. A fitting metaphor for his life. But maybe, just maybe, this journey would give him the direction he'd been missing. Maybe purpose was its own kind of north, pulling a man forward, even when the path wasn't clear. He slept poorly again, waking before dawn. His body protested as he stood, every joint stiff and sore. He was too old for this kind of riding. But age didn't matter, only the mission mattered. The third day nearly killed them both. The sun climbed higher and hotter than the previous days, turning the desert into an oven. Bess stumbled twice before noon, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Eli dismounted and walked beside her, leading her gently, talking to her in low, soothing tones. They were partners in this now, bound by necessity and mutual suffering. The canteen was nearly empty by midday. Eli allowed himself only the smallest sips, enough to keep his tongue from swelling, but not enough to truly quench his thirst. His head pounded with dehydration. The horizon shimmered and danced, creating false images of water and shade that disappeared as they approached. By afternoon, Bess collapsed. She simply stopped walking and sank to her knees, her sides heaving. Eli tried to coax her up, but she couldn't rise. Her eyes rolled back, showing white. She was done. Eli knelt beside her, stroking her neck, speaking words of comfort he didn't feel. This faithful animal had given everything she had, and it wasn't enough. The desert was too vast, the heat too intense. He'd asked too much of her. He unsaddled her, removing the weight from her back. He poured the last of the water into his hat and held it to her mouth. She drank weakly, her tongue barely able to lap at the precious liquid. When it was gone, Eli sat beside her, his hand on her neck, feeling her labored breathing. He couldn't leave her to suffer. That would be cruel. But he couldn't bring himself to end her pain either. So he sat with her as the sun moved across the sky, offering what comfort his presence could provide. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Bess's breathing became shallower. Eli talked to her about the stable in Redemption Springs, about cool water and fresh hay, about rest and peace. He thanked her for her service, for carrying him this far. He told her she'd been brave and strong, and everything a horse should be. When her breathing finally stopped, Eli sat for a long moment, with his hand on her still warm neck. Then he stood, shouldering his saddlebag and the supplies he could carry. The rest he left behind. He was on foot now, alone in the heart of the desert, still 2 days from Fort Halloran. The rational part of his mind knew he wouldn't make it. No man could walk 2 days through this heat without water. He would die out here, his bones would bleach in the sun, and Samuel's message would die with him. All those families counting on this information would lose their land, their livelihoods, their futures. But Eli Thorne had never been a man who gave up easily. Even when he'd lost everything else, he'd held on to his stubborn pride. If he was going to die, he'd die moving forward. He'd die trying. He walked through the afternoon, his shadow stretching long before him. Each step was an effort. His legs felt like lead. His mouth was so dry he couldn't swallow. The sun hammered down on his head despite his hat. Sweat had stopped coming hours ago. His body had no moisture left to give. As evening approached, his vision began to blur. He stumbled over rocks he couldn't see clearly. His thoughts became confused, fragmenting into memories and hallucinations. He saw his daughter as a child, running toward him with outstretched arms. He saw his wife on their wedding day. He saw Sarah Brennan standing in her store, telling him he was a good man. The sun touched the horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and red. Beautiful, Eli thought distantly. He'd forgotten how beautiful the desert could be when you weren't fighting it, when you just accepted what it was. He fell to his knees, no longer able to stand. The saddlebag slipped from his shoulder. The blood-stained letter lay in the sand beside him, so close, yet impossibly far from its destination. He'd failed, just like he'd failed at everything else in his life. The sun set, and darkness rushed across the desert like a wave. Eli lay down in the sand, his cheek against the still warm earth. This was where his story ended. Not with glory or redemption, but with quiet failure under an indifferent sky. Consciousness returned slowly, accompanied by the sensation of something warm and wet against his face. Eli's eyes opened to find a magnificent white stallion standing over him, its dark eyes fixed on his with an intensity that seemed almost human. The horse nudged him again, gentle but insistent, its breath warm against his skin. Eli tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. He managed only a croak. The stallion stepped back, watching him with that strange, intelligent gaze. In the pale light of dawn, its coat seemed to glow, pure white against the muted browns and greys of the desert. With tremendous effort, Eli pushed himself to sitting. His head swam with dizziness and dehydration. He should be dead. By all rights, he should have died in the night. Yet here he was, alive. And here was this magnificent animal that had appeared from nowhere. The stallion walked a few paces away, then turned back to look at him. It was clear what the animal wanted. "Follow me." Eli had worked with horses his entire life, and he'd never seen one communicate so clearly without words. Using a nearby rock for support, Eli struggled to his feet. His legs trembled beneath him. He picked up his saddlebag, the weight of it nearly toppling him. The stallion waited patiently, then began walking at a slow pace, constantly looking back to ensure Eli followed. They walked for perhaps 20 minutes, though time felt strange and elastic in Eli's depleted state. The stallion led him around a massive outcropping of rock, and there, hidden in a natural depression, was a pool of water. Not a mirage, but real water, fed by an underground spring. Desert plants clustered around it, proof of its permanence. Eli fell to his knees at the water's edge and drank. Not too much at first, though his body screamed for more. He knew from experience that drinking too quickly after severe dehydration could make him sick. He took measured sips, waiting between each one, letting his body adjust. The stallion drank beside him, their reflections wavering together on the water's surface. Eli studied the animal more closely. It was a magnificent creature, powerfully built with clean lines and obvious strength. No saddle marks on its back, no brand on its flank. A wild horse then, but wild horses didn't seek out dying men in the desert. They didn't lead them to water with such clear purpose. After drinking his fill, Eli splashed water on his face and neck, feeling the blessed coolness against his sun-scorched skin. He refilled his canteen, then looked around the small oasis. There were edible plants here, tough desert vegetation that could sustain a man if he knew what to look for. And Eli knew. Years of frontier living had taught him which plants were safe and which would kill you. He gathered what he could, eating slowly, methodically. The stallion grazed nearby, never moving far from him. As Eli's strength began to return, he found himself studying the animal with growing wonder. Where had it come from? Why had it helped him? Wild horses were skittish around humans, yet this one acted almost tame. Near the water's edge, half buried in sand, Eli noticed something unusual. He reached down and pulled out an ancient bridle, the leather dark with age and weather. Strange markings were tooled into the leather, symbols he didn't recognize. They looked old, perhaps indigenous in origin, but unlike any tribal markings he'd seen before. On impulse, he approached the stallion with the bridle. The horse didn't shy away. Instead, it lowered its head as if in invitation. Eli slipped the bridle on, and the moment he did, something changed. The air seemed to thrum with energy. The stallion's eyes met his, and Eli felt a connection form, something deeper than the usual bond between horse and rider. It was as if he could sense the animal's thoughts, not as words, but as impressions, feelings, intentions. The stallion was here to help him, to guide him. There was purpose in this meeting, something larger than chance or coincidence. "Who are you?" Eli whispered. "What are you?" The stallion nickered softly, tossing its magnificent head. Eli felt rather than heard the answer. A friend, a guide, someone who wouldn't let him fail. "I need to get to Fort Halloran," Eli said, feeling slightly foolish talking to a horse as if it could understand. "I have a message to deliver. People's lives depend on it." The stallion turned, facing northwest, toward Fort Halloran. Then it looked back at Eli, the message clear. "I know. I'll take you there." Eli rested at the oasis through the heat of the day, regaining his strength while the stallion grazed peacefully nearby. He examined the ancient bridle more closely, tracing the strange symbols with his finger. They seemed to pulse with meaning just beyond his understanding, like words in a language he'd once known but had forgotten. He thought about the old stories, the ones told around campfires by frontiersmen and indigenous guides. Tales of spirit horses that appeared to travelers in need, of sacred animals that bridged the world between the living and something beyond. He'd always dismissed such stories as superstition, the kind of folklore that grew from too many nights alone under vast skies. But now, sitting beside this remarkable creature, he wondered if those old storytellers had known something he'd been too practical to believe. "I should give you a name," Eli said, his voice still rough from dehydration. "Can't just keep calling you horse in my head." The stallion raised its head, ears pricked forward, attentive. "Asher," Eli decided. "Like the ash-white light at dawn, the color that comes before the sun rises. That's when I first saw you clearly, and that's when you gave me back my life." The stallion, now Asher, seemed to approve. He moved closer and pressed his soft muzzle against Eli's shoulder, a gesture of affection that brought unexpected emotion welling up in the old cowboy's chest. When was the last time any living creature had shown him such simple, uncomplicated kindness? As afternoon shadows lengthened, Eli pulled out his father's compass. To his astonishment, the needle was moving, not spinning uselessly as it had for years, but trembling, seeking, and finally settling on a direction. Northwest, toward Fort Halloran. "Well, I'll be," Eli whispered. "You're fixing more than just my body, aren't you?" He mounted Asher without saddle or stirrups, something he hadn't done since he was a young man. The stallion stood perfectly still, making it easy despite Eli's weakened state. The moment he settled onto Asher's back, that strange connection deepened. He could feel the animal's strength flowing through him, steadying his balance, clearing his mind. They left the oasis as the day cooled, moving at an easy pace that ate up miles without exhausting either of them. Asher seemed to know exactly where to place each hoof, navigating terrain that would have been treacherous in failing light. Eli simply held onto the mane and trusted, something he hadn't done in a very long time. As night fell, Asher led them to a sheltered spot among tall rock formations. There was no water here, but they'd both drunk their fill at the oasis. Eli made a small fire from dried brush, more for comfort than warmth. The desert night had turned cold, but Asher positioned himself to block the wind, his large body providing a natural windbreak. Eli sat with his back against a rock, the fire crackling softly, and found himself talking, not to himself, but to Asher. The words came slowly at first, then faster, spilling out like water from a broken dam. "I had a daughter once. I still do, I suppose, though she hasn't spoken to me in years. Margaret, named her after my mother." He stared into the flames, seeing faces there that memory had kept vivid despite time's passage. "She was the brightest thing in my life. Smart as a whip, brave as a lion cub, used to follow me everywhere when she was small." Asher settled onto the ground beside him, close enough that Eli could feel his warmth. The stallion's presence was comforting in a way Eli couldn't quite explain. "I ruined it all," Eli continued. "The Pony Express ended, and I couldn't find my footing in the new world. The West was changing, becoming civilized, and I didn't know how to be civilized. So I drank. I drank away our savings, our ranch, my wife's patience. Elizabeth took Margaret and left, and I couldn't blame her. I was a shell of a man by then." The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. "I kept telling myself I'd stop, that I'd get myself together and win them back. But years passed, and I just kept failing. Margaret grew up without me. She made something of herself despite me, not because of me. Got herself educated, married a good man. Probably has children of her own by now, and I've never met them." Eli's voice cracked. "I don't know why I'm telling you this. You're a horse, a mysterious, possibly magical horse, but still a horse. Yet somehow, you're the first living thing in years that's made me feel like maybe I'm worth something after all." Asher lifted his head and looked at Eli with those deep, knowing eyes. The fourth day of the journey began with renewed hope. Eli woke feeling stronger than he had in years, his body responding to rest, water, and the strange energy that seemed to flow from Asher. They traveled through changing landscape, the flat desert giving way to rolling hills dotted with scrub and cactus. Asher moved with a purpose that went beyond simply heading northwest. He would occasionally detour from the most direct path, leading Eli around obstacles that weren't immediately visible. Twice they avoided areas where the ground looked solid, but would have given way under weight. Once Asher led them in a wide circle around a rocky outcrop, and when Eli glanced back, he saw a rattlesnake coiled in the exact spot they would have rested. "You're protecting me," Eli said, patting the stallion's neck. "Like you can see dangers I can't." By midday, they came upon another water source, this one a narrow stream cutting through red rock. Eli dismounted to drink and refill his canteen. As he knelt by the water, movement in the distance caught his eye. Riders, 3 of them, maybe 2 miles away, moving parallel to his course. His heart quickened. Could be innocent travelers. Could be Vernon Cross's men, hunting for Samuel's message. Either way, caution was warranted. Eli stayed low, watching them. They were scanning the terrain, searching. Definitely hunters, not travelers. Asher nudged him urgently. "Time to move." Eli mounted quickly, and the stallions set off at a ground-eating trot that took them into rougher country where following would be difficult. Throughout the afternoon, Eli caught glimpses of the riders, always at a distance, never quite able to catch up. It was as if Asher knew exactly how to stay just beyond their reach. As the sun began its descent, Asher led them into a narrow canyon with high walls. Eli felt exposed, trapped, but the stallion moved confidently forward. The canyon twisted and turned, growing narrower until they emerged into a small, hidden valley. Rock walls surrounded it on 3 sides, with only the narrow canyon entrance providing access. "Good thinking," Eli said, sliding from Asher's back. "They'd have to come through single file, and we'd hear them coming." He built a small fire in a depression where the light wouldn't be visible from outside the valley. As darkness fell, he sat close to the flames, thinking about the riders. If they were Cross's men, they were persistent. But how had they picked up his trail? He'd been careful, and after Bess died, tracking him on foot should have been nearly impossible. Unless they weren't tracking him. Unless they were simply covering all routes to Fort Halloran, knowing that whoever carried Samuel's message would have to pass through this region eventually. "We have 1 day left," Eli said to Asher. "1 more day and we reach the fort. But they'll be watching the approaches. They'll be waiting." Asher stood at the valley entrance, ears forward, alert. The stallion's vigilance was constant, unwavering. He never seemed to tire, never seemed to need the rest that Eli's aging body required. Eli pulled out the blood-stained letter, holding it to the firelight. So much depended on this piece of paper. Families he'd never met, children he'd never see. Their futures rested in his weathered hands. The weight of it pressed on him, but differently than it had before. Now, instead of feeling crushed by responsibility, he felt strengthened by purpose. He thought about Sarah's words. "You're a good man." He dismissed them at the time, convinced she was just being kind. But maybe there was truth there he'd been too bitter to recognize. Maybe goodness wasn't about never failing. Maybe it was about getting back up after failure and trying again. "My father gave me this compass," Eli said, pulling it from his pocket. The needle pointed steadily northwest now, unwavering. "He told me it would always point me home. But I lost my home, Asher. I lost everything that mattered. For years, I thought that meant I had no direction left to follow." The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the canyon walls. "But maybe home isn't a place. Maybe it's a purpose. Maybe it's knowing that what you're doing matters, even if nobody remembers your name afterward." Eli looked at the compass, then at Asher. "You've given me that. This journey, this mission, it's giving me something I thought I'd lost forever. It's giving me a reason to be the man I once was." Asher moved closer, lowering his head so it rested against Eli's chest. The gesture was so tender, so knowing, that Eli felt tears sting his eyes. He wrapped his arms around the stallion's neck, holding on, as if Asher were the only solid thing in a shifting world. "Thank you," he whispered. "Whatever you are, wherever you came from, thank you for finding me." They left the hidden valley before dawn, moving through the pre-dawn darkness with Asher's uncanny ability to navigate. The air was cold and sharp, turning their breath to mist. Eli's hands were stiff with chill as he gripped Asher's mane, but the stallion's warmth beneath him kept the worst of the cold at bay. As the sun rose, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, they reached higher ground. From a rocky promontory, Eli could see the land stretching before them. In the far distance, barely visible through the morning haze, were the stone walls of Fort Halloran. So close now. One day's hard ride, but between them and the fort, the land was open and exposed. No canyons to hide in, no rocks large enough to provide cover. Anyone watching would see them coming from miles away. It would be the most dangerous part of the journey. Eli pulled out Samuel's pocket watch, which he'd kept since finding it in the saddlebag. The hands had stopped at 3:10, the moment Samuel had been shot. He wound it carefully, hearing the familiar tick as it came back to life. Time was moving again, counting down the hours until the message reached its destination or died with him in the attempt. "We'll have to be smart about this," Eli said, studying the terrain. "If those riders are watching the direct approaches, we need to circle wide, come in from an unexpected angle." Asher tossed his head as if in agreement. They descended from the promontory and began a long arc to the east, adding miles to their journey but potentially avoiding watchful eyes. The land here was slightly less barren, with occasional stands of juniper and pinyon pine providing scattered cover. As they rode, Eli found his thoughts returning to his past, not with the usual bitterness and regret, but with a kind of gentle acceptance. He'd made mistakes. He'd hurt people he loved. He'd wasted years drowning in self-pity and whiskey. But those failures had led him here, to this moment, to this mission that might actually mean something. Perhaps that was the nature of redemption. Not erasing the past, but finding a way to make the future matter despite it. Around midday, Asher suddenly stopped, his ears flicking forward in alert. Eli tensed, scanning the landscape. There, in a shallow draw, perhaps half a mile ahead, he saw them. The same 3 riders from yesterday, their horses tied, while the men rested in the shade of a rock formation. They were positioned to watch the main approach to Fort Halloran. Eli's hand moved instinctively to his Navy Colt, checking that it was secure in its holster. He hadn't fired it in years, didn't even know if it still worked properly. But it might be all that stood between him and failure. Asher began moving again, circling even wider, using the terrain to stay hidden. They moved slowly, carefully, every step measured to avoid detection. The sun beat down as they navigated through rough country, but Eli barely noticed. All his attention was focused on staying unseen, on reaching the fort without confrontation. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky. Fort Halloran grew closer, its stone walls more distinct against the horizon. Eli checked Samuel's watch repeatedly, as if watching time would make it pass faster. They had to reach the fort by nightfall. The message had to be delivered within the 5-day deadline, or settlements would be forced to surrender their water rights to Vernon Cross. As afternoon shadows lengthened, they crested a final rise and saw Fort Halloran spread before them, less than 5 miles away. So close, almost there. Eli's heart hammered in his chest with a mixture of exhaustion, fear, and hope. But between them and safety, crossing open ground on the fort's eastern approach, were more riders. At least 6 this time, spread in a loose line, clearly watching for anyone attempting to reach the fort. They'd anticipated the eastern route. Cross's men were thorough. He'd give them that. "Well," Eli said quietly to Asher, "I don't see any way around them this time. We're going to have to go through." Asher pawed the ground, his muscles tensing beneath Eli. The Stallion was ready. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Eli drew his revolver and checked the cylinder. 6 shots. 6 bullets against 6 men, assuming there weren't more he couldn't see. The odds weren't good. But then, the odds hadn't been good since the moment he'd accepted this mission. He'd survived this far on stubbornness, luck, and the inexplicable help of this magnificent creature beneath him. He stroked Asher's neck, drawing courage from the Stallion's steady presence. "If we're going to die," he said, "at least we'll die trying. At least we'll die doing something that matters." Asher nickered softly, then began moving forward at a walk, slow and steady, conserving strength for what was coming. The riders below hadn't spotted them yet, but they would, soon. The shout came just as the sun touched the horizon, turning the sky blood red. One of the riders had spotted them. Within seconds, All 6 men were mounted and moving, converging on Eli's position with practiced efficiency. These weren't random hired guns. They moved like soldiers, coordinated and disciplined. "Go!" Eli said to Asher, and the stallion exploded into motion. They raced down the slope, Asher's hooves finding purchase on loose rock that should have sent them tumbling. The wind tore at Eli's face as they flew across the desert, and behind them came the thunder of pursuing horses. Shots rang out, bullets whining past, but the distance was still too great for accuracy. Asher ran like nothing Eli had ever experienced. The stallion's speed was supernatural, eating up ground faster than should have been possible. But the fort was still miles away, and the pursuers were spreading out, trying to flank them, cut off their escape. Eli risked a glance back. The riders were gaining, their fresher horses closing the distance. He leaned forward, pressing himself flat against Asher's neck, making himself a smaller target. More shots. One bullet came close enough that he heard it pass, a distinctive crack in the air beside his ear. The land rose slightly ahead, a low ridge that might provide momentary cover. Asher surged up and over it, and for a few precious seconds they were out of sight of their pursuers. Eli used that time to check his surroundings, looking for any advantage the terrain might offer. To the north, perhaps a quarter-mile away, was a jumble of large boulders, the kind of formation that flash floods carved over centuries. If they could reach it, they'd have cover. They could make a stand there, defend themselves from behind stone, instead of being cut down in the open. But changing direction would let the riders close the gap. It was a gamble. Trust in Asher's speed and try to outrun them to the fort, or seek cover and hope 6 bullets were enough to hold off 6 men. As if sensing his thoughts, Asher veered north without being directed. The stallion had made the choice for them. They raced toward the rocks as the pursuing riders crested the ridge behind them, their shouts carrying across the desert. The gap between hunter and hunted narrowed. 200 yards, 150. Eli could hear the labored breathing of the horses behind them now. 100 yards, 50. The rocks loomed ahead, massive and ancient, promising shelter and a fighting chance. They reached the boulders as bullets kicked up dust around them. Eli threw himself from Asher's back, rolling behind cover as lead sparked off stone where he'd been standing a moment before. Asher vanished between the rocks, moving deeper into the formation. "Stay down," Eli called after him, though he had no idea if the stallion would obey or even understand. He pressed his back against a boulder, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart hammering. The Navy Colt felt heavy in his hand. He'd fired it at targets, at bottles and cans, but never at a man. That had been deliberate. After leaving the Pony Express, he'd promised himself he was done with violence. But promises made in peace often broke in necessity. The riders were dismounting, taking up positions around the rock formation. They had him surrounded. 6 against 1, and they knew it. One of them called out, his voice rough and confident. "No need for anyone to die here, old man. Just toss out that saddlebag and walk away. We don't care about you. Just the message." Eli checked his ammunition. 6 bullets. His hands were steady, he noted with some surprise. Whatever fear he felt wasn't translating into trembling fingers. Maybe age had that advantage. You'd seen enough of life that death didn't seem quite so terrifying anymore. "Can't do that," he called back. "This message is going to Fort Halloran. It's going to command a price, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Harsh laughter answered him. "You're trapped in those rocks. Your horse ran off. You've got maybe 1 gun with maybe 6 shots. We've got all night to wait you out. By morning, you'll be begging to give us that message in exchange for water." They had a point. Eli had no water left. His canteen had been on Asher's saddle, and the stallion had disappeared into the rocks. He could last the night, but by morning he'd be desperate with thirst. And if they were patient, they'd win without firing another shot. But something told him these men weren't patient types. Vernon Cross wouldn't have hired patient men. He'd have hired killers who took pleasure in their work. The first man made his move just as full darkness fell. Eli heard the scrape of boot on stone, the careful placement of weight meant to be silent but not quite silent enough. He pivoted, aimed at the shadow moving between boulders, and fired. The shot echoed like thunder in the rock formation. The shadow fell with a cry of pain. Not a killing shot. Eli's aim was off in the darkness, but enough to stop the man's advance. Angry shouts erupted from the other riders. 5 bullets left. They opened fire, multiple guns at once, creating a storm of lead that ricocheted off stone all around him. Eli pressed himself flat, covering his head as rock chips rained down. The barrage lasted perhaps 30 seconds, long enough to empty several revolvers. Then silence fell, broken only by the wounded man's cursing. "That was stupid, old man," a voice called out. "Different from before, harder edged. Now we know you'll shoot." "Now this gets personal," Eli said nothing. "Let them wonder, let them worry." Every moment they delayed was another moment closer to dawn, another moment closer to the fort, realizing something was wrong and perhaps sending out a patrol. But who was he fooling? Fort Halloran had no reason to send out patrols. They didn't know he was coming. They didn't know about the message or the danger. As far as they were concerned, this was just another peaceful night in the Arizona Territory. A sound behind him made Eli spin, gun raised. But it was Asher, emerging from deeper in the rock formation. The stallion carried Eli's canteen in his teeth, offering it. Eli took it with trembling hands, unscrewing the cap to find it full of water. Somehow, impossibly, Asher had found water in this dry maze of stone. "You're full of miracles, aren't you?" Eli whispered, drinking deeply. Asher nudged him, then moved to the gap between 2 boulders, looking out at where the riders waited. The stallion's ears were flat against his head, his entire body tense with aggression. This magnificent creature was ready to fight for him. "No," Eli said softly, placing a hand on Asher's neck. "You've done enough. You've gotten me this far. I won't ask you to risk yourself in my fight." But even as he said it, he knew the choice wasn't entirely his. Asher had his own purpose here, his own reasons for appearing in the desert when Eli was dying. Whatever force had sent this spirit horse, it hadn't sent him just to abandon Eli at the moment of greatest danger. Movement again, this time from 2 directions at once. They were coordinating now, trying to catch him in a crossfire. Eli chose the closer target and fired. The muzzle flash lit up the night, and he saw the man diving for cover. A miss, but close enough to make the man think twice about advancing. 4 bullets left. The return fire was immediate and concentrated. They'd marked his position from the muzzle flash. Bullets hammered the boulder he crouched behind, and one passed so close to his head that he felt the heat of its passage. He scrambled backward, changing position, knowing that staying in one place was suicide. The rock formation wasn't large, maybe 50 feet across, a chaotic jumble of boulders that had tumbled from the ridge above over countless years. It provided cover but also trapped him. They could wait him out, pick him off the moment he tried to run. The smart play for them was patience. The smart play for him was desperation. Hours crawled past. Eli moved between positions, never staying long in one spot, conserving his remaining ammunition. The riders tried twice more to advance, and each time he drove them back with carefully aimed shots. 2 bullets left now, and dawn was still hours away. His body ached from tension and old injuries. His shoulder throbbed where he'd rolled too hard on the rocks. Thirst gnawed him despite the water Asher had provided. But worse than physical discomfort was the growing certainty that he wouldn't make it, that Samuel's message would die here, that those families depending on it would lose their land and livelihoods because one old cowboy wasn't quite good enough. Asher stayed close, his presence a comfort even if it couldn't change the tactical reality. Eli found himself talking to the stallion in whispers, sharing thoughts he'd never shared with any human. "I used to be afraid of dying," he said. "When I was young, death seemed like the worst thing that could happen. But as I got older, I realized there are worse things than dying. Living without purpose, that's worse. Living without mattering to anyone, that's worse. At least now at the end I'm dying for something that matters. That's more than I thought I'd get." Asher pressed his head against Eli's chest, and again Eli felt that strange connection, that sense of understanding that transcended normal communication between man and animal. The moon rose, casting silver light across the desert and turning the standoff into something almost beautiful. Eli could see the riders more clearly now, see them conferring in low voices, planning their next move. They were getting impatient. Good. Impatient men made mistakes. One of them stood, silhouetted against the moonlit sky, and called out again. "We're done playing games, old man. Cross wants that message destroyed, and we aim to collect our pay. You can die quick or you can die slow. Your choice." "There's a third choice," Eli called back. "You boys ride away now. Tell Cross you never found me. Live to see another sunrise." Laughter answered him, but it had a hollow sound. These men knew they were dealing with someone who wouldn't surrender. Someone willing to die for what he carried. That knowledge made them cautious, and caution was Eli's only advantage. "Who are you?" another voice asked, younger than the first. "What's so important about that message you'd die for it?" Eli considered not answering, then decided there was no harm in truth. "It's proof that Vernon Cross is hoarding water rights during a drought. Proof that'll hold up in federal court. 3 settlements are about to lose everything because of his greed. Families, children, good people who've worked hard for what little they have." Silence greeted this. Then the younger voice again, uncertain now. "That's what this is about? Water rights. Cross didn't tell you?" Eli felt a small spark of hope. "He just told you to kill whoever was carrying a message, didn't he? Didn't tell you what the message said or why he wanted it destroyed." More silence. Eli pressed his advantage. "You're helping a rich man steal from poor families. Helping him take away their livelihoods, maybe their lives. That sit right with you, boys?" "Don't listen to him," the hard-edged voice snapped. "Cross pays good money. What he does with water rights ain't our concern." "Maybe not," Eli agreed. "But when those children die of thirst, when those families lose everything, you'll know you helped make it happen. You'll know you could have walked away and chose not to. That's something you'll carry the rest of your lives." "Shut up," the hard voice snarled. "Just shut up." But Eli could hear dissent in the whispered arguments that followed. He'd planted doubt, and doubt was a powerful weapon. Not all men who hired out their guns were heartless killers. Some were just desperate for money, willing to do things they normally wouldn't. Give them a reason to reconsider, and they might take it. Of course, some men were heartless killers, and those wouldn't be swayed by appeals to conscience. The night wore on. Eli's eyes burned with exhaustion, his body crying out for sleep. But sleeping meant dying. He forced himself to stay alert, checking his remaining ammunition obsessively. 2 bullets, 2 chances to make a difference. Asher suddenly tensed, his ears pricked toward the south. Eli listened, straining to hear what the stallion had detected. At first nothing, then faint in the distance the sound of hoofbeats. Multiple horses, moving at speed. The riders heard it too. Their whispered conversation grew urgent, worried. Reinforcements coming? But for which side? The hoofbeats grew louder, and then riders burst into view. Not more of Cross's men, but soldiers. A patrol from Fort Halloran, drawn by the sound of gunfire in the night. 6 troopers led by an officer, their uniforms visible in the moonlight. The hard-voiced rider cursed viciously. "Mount up," he ordered his men. "We're done here." "Hold it right there," the officer commanded, his hand on his sidearm. "Nobody moves until we sort out what's happening." Eli stood slowly, his hands visible, his revolver pointed safely at the ground. "Lieutenant," he called out. "My name is Eli Thorne. I'm carrying an urgent message for Commander Price at Fort Halloran. These men tried to stop me from delivering it." "That true?" the lieutenant asked the riders. "We were hired to protect Mr. Cross's interest," the hard-voiced man said smoothly. "This man is carrying stolen documents." "The documents aren't stolen," Eli said. "They're evidence of water rights violations. Samuel Webb died getting this information to me. He was shot by Cross's men trying to prevent delivery." The lieutenant studied both groups, his expression thoughtful. "Well, this is easily resolved. Mr. Thorne, you'll come with us to the fort. Your message can be delivered to Commander Price, and he'll determine its legitimacy. As for you, gentlemen, you're free to go. But if I catch you within 5 miles of the fort, I'll assume hostile intent." The riders exchanged glances. The hard-voiced man looked like he wanted to argue, but 6 soldiers with rifles trumped 6 hired guns with revolvers. "We'll be going then," the man said after a long moment. "But this ain't over." "It is for tonight," the lieutenant said firmly. "Ride out!" They mounted and left, their wounded comrades supported between two horses. Eli watched them go, feeling the tension drain from his body like water from a broken vessel. His legs nearly buckled, and he caught himself against a boulder. The lieutenant dismounted and approached, his young face showing concern. "You look like you've been through hell, sir." "Close enough to see the flames," Eli agreed. "How'd you happen to be out here?" "Routine patrol. We heard gunfire and came to investigate." The lieutenant looked at Asher, who stood calmly despite the presence of military horses. "That's a fine animal. Never seen a horse quite like him." "He's special," Eli said, moving to Asher's side and running a hand down the stallion's neck. "Saved my life more than once on this journey." They rode to Fort Halloran with the patrol, covering the last few miles as dawn broke across the desert. Eli swayed in exhaustion, barely able to stay mounted, but Asher's steady gait kept him secure. The fort's walls grew larger, solid and reassuring, promising safety and rest. They passed through the gates as the sun cleared the horizon. Soldiers going about morning duties stopped to stare at the strange procession. Eli dismounted stiffly, every muscle protesting, and the lieutenant led him to the commander's office. Commander Price was a solid man in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades on the frontier. He listened to Eli's story without interruption, his expression growing graver as the tale unfolded. When Eli finished, he pulled the blood-stained letter from his saddlebag and placed it on the commander's desk. "Samuel Webb died getting this to me. He said you'd know what to do with it. He said to tell you the old codes." Price's face softened at the mention of Samuel's name. "Sam and I served together in the war. Good man. The best." He broke the seal and unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the coded text. His expression darkened as he read. "This is worse than water rights violations," he said quietly. "This is systematic theft on a massive scale. Gross has been buying judges, falsifying claims, using legal manipulation to steal from people who can't afford to fight back." He looked up at Eli. "Samuel was right to die for this. This information will stop Cross and help dozens of families." Relief washed over Eli so powerfully he had to sit down. "So it was worth it. The journey, the danger, all of it. More than worth it," Price assured him. "I'll have this information telegraphed to the territorial governor immediately. We'll have federal marshals here within a week." He stood and extended his hand. "Mr. Thorne, you've done a great service. Those families you helped will probably never know your name, but their children will grow up with homes and water because of what you did." Eli shook the commander's hand, feeling something settle in his chest. Purpose fulfilled. Mission accomplished. For the first time in 20 years, he'd finished something that mattered. "You're welcome to rest here as long as you need," Price continued. "The post doctor should look at you. You appear to have lost considerable weight, and those are rope burns on your wrists from handling reins without gloves." "I'd appreciate that, sir. But first, I need to see to my horse. He's the real hero of this story." They walked to the stables together, where Asher was being brushed down by a young private. The stallion's white coat gleamed in the morning light, unmarred by the hard journey they'd completed. He looked as fresh as if he'd spent the week in a comfortable pasture, rather than crossing the brutal desert. "Never seen a horse in such condition after a 5-day ride," the private marveled. "It's like he isn't even tired." "He's a special animal," Eli said, approaching Asher. The stallion turned his head and regarded Eli with those deep, knowing eyes. There was something in that gaze, a sense of completion, of purpose served. "Thank you," Eli whispered, pressing his forehead to Asher's, "for everything. For finding me, for saving me, for getting me here. I don't know what you are or why you came, but I'm grateful beyond words." Asher nickered softly, his breath warm against Eli's face. Then the stallion stepped back, and Eli felt the connection between them shift, not breaking but transforming. The immediate urgency was gone, replaced by something gentler, more permanent. "Mr. Thorne," the commander said, "let's get you fed and rested. You've earned it." Eli followed Price from the stable, glancing back once at Asher. The stallion watched him go, standing in a shaft of morning sunlight that made his white coat seem to glow. Eli spent 3 days recovering at Fort Halloran. The post doctor treated his dehydration, bandaged his rope burns, and marveled that a man his age had survived such a journey. Commander Price provided comfortable quarters and regular meals, luxuries Eli had almost forgotten existed. But despite the comfort, Eli found himself restless. He'd completed his mission, delivered the message, saved those families. Yet instead of feeling satisfied, he felt strangely empty. Purpose had driven him for 5 days, pushing him beyond his limits, giving his life meaning. Now that purpose was fulfilled, what remained? He visited Asher daily in the stables. The stallion remained as magnificent as ever, accepting attention from the soldiers who'd become fascinated by him. But something had changed. The urgent connection Eli had felt during their journey had faded to a gentler awareness. Asher no longer needed to guide him, to protect him, to push him forward. The immediate task was done. On the 4th morning, Commander Price summoned Eli to his office. The older man looked troubled as he gestured for Eli to sit. "I've received disturbing news," Price said without preamble. "Vernon Cross has been arrested based on the evidence in Samuel's letter. But before the marshals could take him into custody, he named accomplices. Claimed he wasn't acting alone. Who?" Eli asked, though part of him already knew the answer wouldn't be simple. "He's accusing prominent citizens across 3 territories. Judges, land office officials, even a territorial senator. Says they were all part of the scheme." Price rubbed his face wearily. "Some of these accusations are credible. Others seem designed to create chaos and delay his trial. It's going to take months to sort out. But the water rights, the families Samuel died protecting, they're safe. Yes, that part is resolved. Federal authorities have already begun restoring proper water access." Price leaned forward. "But there's something else you should know. Cross put a bounty on your head before his arrest. $5,000 for whoever kills the man who delivered the message." The number hit Eli like a physical blow. $5,000 was more money than most frontier families saw in a lifetime. Men would cross continents for that kind of reward. "The bounty will stand until Cross dies or withdraws it," Price continued. "And given his resources and connections, even from jail, he can make sure it reaches the right ears. You're not safe, Eli, not in any town within 1,000 miles. Eli sat back, absorbing this. He'd succeeded in his mission, only to paint a target on his back that would last the rest of his life. Every stranger would be a potential threat, every town a possible trap. "What do you suggest I do?" "Stay here at the fort for now. Let things settle. Eventually Cross will have bigger problems than revenge, and the bounty will be forgotten." Price's tone wasn't entirely convincing. "Or you could go further west. California, perhaps. Start fresh where Cross's influence doesn't reach. Start fresh." The words echoed in Eli's mind as he left the commander's office. At 52, was starting fresh even possible? He'd tried it before, after losing his ranch, after Elizabeth left with Margaret. Each time he'd ended up in the same place, alone, purposeless, slowly drinking himself toward an early grave. But something was different now. He'd proven something to himself on that desert crossing. He'd proven he could still be the man he once was when it mattered. That man didn't run from consequences. That man faced what came with steady nerve and clear eyes. He went to the stables and found Asher dozing in his stall, one hip cocked, completely relaxed. The stallion's eyes opened as Eli approached, and that deep intelligence focused on him once more. "I need your advice," Eli said quietly, though he felt foolish asking guidance from a horse. "Do I hide here? Do I run west? Or do I go back to Redemption Springs and face whatever comes?" Asher stepped forward and pressed his nose to Eli's chest, directly over his heart. The gesture was clear. "Listen to what's in here. Trust what you know is right." Eli pulled out his father's compass. The needle pointed steadily north, back toward Redemption Springs, back toward Sarah Brennan's kindness, back toward the life he'd left behind when he accepted Samuel's mission. But was that compass pointing toward home or toward danger? Was it showing him where he should go, or simply where he'd come from? "I have a daughter," Eli said to Asher. "Margaret. She's grown now, living back east, hasn't spoken to me in 6 years. But if I'm going to die, If Cross's bounty is going to catch up with me eventually, shouldn't I try to make peace with her first? Shouldn't I at least try to tell her I'm sorry for failing her? Asher nickered softly, and Eli felt that familiar sense of understanding flow between them. Yes, make peace with your past. Heal what can be healed. That afternoon, Eli sat at a small desk in his quarters, with paper and pen borrowed from the fort's clerk. Writing a letter to Margaret felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing he had to jump but terrified of the fall. He started 3 times, crumpling each attempt and beginning again. The 4th attempt felt right. The words came slowly but honestly, each sentence carefully chosen. "Dear Margaret," he wrote, "I don't know if you'll read this or throw it away unopened. I wouldn't blame you if you did. But I need to write it anyway, even if you never see these words. I need to say what I should have said years ago. I was a terrible father, not in the dramatic way of some men, with violence or cruelty, but in the quiet way of absence and disappointment. I let whiskey become more important than your mother's happiness. I let pride become more important than providing for you. I let my own failures consume me, until there was nothing left for the people who needed me most. You deserved better. You deserved a father who showed up, who kept his promises, who put your needs before his own weakness. I can't change the past, and I won't insult you by asking forgiveness I haven't earned. But I want you to know that not a day passes that I don't think of you. Not a day passes that I don't regret the man I became instead of the father you needed. I'm writing this from Fort Halloran. I've just completed a journey that nearly killed me, carrying a message that helped save families from losing their homes. For 5 days I was the man I should have been all along, the man your grandfather raised me to be, the man I was before I lost my way. I don't know what the future holds, but I wanted you to know that I'm trying to be better, trying to live with honor, even if it's too late to repair what I broke. If you ever find it in your heart to write back, I would treasure hearing from you. But if you don't, I understand. Some things break beyond mending. Your father, Eli Thorne, he sealed the letter before he could second-guess himself and gave it to the fort's courier with instructions to send it to Margaret's address in Philadelphia. The cost took most of his remaining money, but it was the best use of funds he could imagine. That evening, he walked the fort's perimeter, watching the sun set over the desert he'd crossed. The land looked different from this side, painted in gold and purple, beautiful in a way that seemed impossible after what it had put him through. But perhaps that was the nature of hard things. They looked different once you'd survived them. Commander Price found him there, standing at the wall, lost in thought. "You're planning to leave?" Price said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, I can't hide here forever. And the people of Redemption Springs, they took a chance on me. Sarah Brennan gave me supplies on credit. Tom Haskins lent me a horse that died in service. I owe them the truth about what happened. You'll be riding into danger. Cross's men will be watching that town." "I know." Eli turned to face the commander. "But I can't spend the rest of my life running. That's what I did after losing my family, after losing my ranch. I ran from responsibility, from consequences, from everything that reminded me of my failures. I'm done running." Price studied him for a long moment. "You've changed since you arrived. You look like a man who's found something he'd lost. Maybe I have. Or maybe I'm just old enough now to understand that living with fear is worse than dying with purpose." Eli smiled slightly. "Besides, I've got Asher. That stallion has pulled me through worse than bounty hunters." "About the horse," Price said carefully. "Some of my men have been saying strange things. That he doesn't eat like normal horses. That they've never seen him sleep. That sometimes in the corner of your eye he doesn't quite look like a horse at all. What do you think?" Eli asked. "I think the desert does strange things to men's perceptions. I think exhaustion and heat can make people see what isn't there." Price paused. "But I also think I've been on the frontier long enough to know that some things can't be explained by logic and reason. If that animal is something more than he appears, then you're lucky to have him." "I am," Eli agreed. "Luckier than I deserve." They stood in comfortable silence, watching night claim the desert. Somewhere out there, men were hunting for Eli, driven by the promise of $5,000. Somewhere out there, his daughter might be reading his letter or burning it, or crying over words that came too late. But none of that changed what he needed to do. He would return to Redemption Springs. He would face whatever consequences came. And if that meant dying, at least he'd die as a man who'd kept his word. Eli left Fort Halloran at dawn on the 6th day. Commander Price provided supplies and offered an armed escort, but Eli declined. Soldiers would only draw attention, and this journey needed to be made quietly. Price gave him one final gift, a new compass, its brass polished bright, its needle pointing true north. "For when you find your way home," the commander said, as they shook hands in farewell. Asher seemed eager to leave, prancing slightly as Eli mounted. The stallion knew where they were going, sensed Eli's determination to face his past rather than flee from it. As they rode through the fort's gates, several soldiers stopped to watch, and Eli heard one of them whisper a prayer for his safety. The journey back was different from the desperate rush to deliver Samuel's message. Now they traveled at a measured pace, following established trails, camping each night under stars that seemed less indifferent than before. Eli talked to Asher during these quiet evenings, sharing memories of his youth, his time with the Pony Express, the early days of his marriage when everything had seemed possible. "Elizabeth was beautiful," he said one night, stirring the campfire embers with a stick. "But more than that, she was strong. Had to be, to marry a man who spent weeks at a time riding dangerous trails. She never complained, never asked me to choose between her and my work. She just asked me to come home safe." Asher's ears flicked toward him, attentive. "After the express shut down, I didn't know who I was anymore. My whole identity had been tied up in being a rider, in being the best at something that suddenly didn't matter. The telegraph made us obsolete overnight." Eli shook his head at the memory. "Instead of finding new purpose, I crawled into a bottle. Told myself it was temporary, that I just needed time to adjust. But temporary became permanent, and by the time I realized what I was doing, it was too late." She'd already packed up Margaret and left. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the night sky. "I don't blame her. She gave me chances more than I deserved. But I kept choosing the bottle over her, over Margaret, over the life we could have had. When she finally left, part of me was almost relieved. I didn't have to pretend anymore. I could stop trying and just accept what I'd become." Eli looked at Asher, finding those deep eyes reflecting firelight. "But you didn't let me stay that way, did you? You found me dying in the desert and gave me another chance. Why? What made you think I was worth saving?" "Duh?" The stallion moved closer, resting his head over Eli's shoulder in a gesture of unmistakable affection. And Eli understood, not in words but in feeling. Asher hadn't saved him because he was worthy. Asher had saved him so he could become worthy. The journey wasn't about earning redemption, but about accepting the opportunity to seek it. On the 4th day of their return journey, they encountered a merchant caravan heading west. The merchant, a jovial man named Henderson, invited Eli to share their evening meal. Around the campfire, Henderson's guards told stories of the frontier, and inevitably the conversation turned to recent events. "You hear about that water rights scandal?" one guard asked. "Vernon Cross, the cattle baron, got arrested for stealing from settlers." "I heard something about it," Eli said carefully. "Word is, some old cowboy rode through hell itself to deliver evidence that took Cross down. They say he crossed the desert on foot after his horse died, showed up at Fort Halloran more dead than alive." The guard shook his head in admiration. "Takes a special kind of man to do something like that." "Or a desperate one," Eli suggested. "Maybe, but desperate men usually think about saving themselves, not about helping families they've never met." The guard poked at the fire. "Course Cross put a bounty on the fellow. $5,000. Every hired gun in 3 territories is looking for him." Henderson looked alarmed. "5,000? That's a fortune." "It is. But I'll tell you something. If I knew who that cowboy was, I wouldn't turn him in for 10,000. Some things matter more than money, and what he did that matters." The guard met Eli's eyes across the fire. "Whoever he is, I hope he stays safe. We need more men like that, not fewer." Eli felt warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. His actions had meant something, not just to the families he'd helped, but to ordinary people who heard the story and recognized something worth admiring. They parted ways the next morning, Henderson pressing supplies on Eli despite his protests. "For your journey wherever you're headed," the merchant said, with a knowing look that suggested he'd figured out more than he let on. 2 days later, familiar landmarks began appearing. The rocky outcrop where Eli had once taken shelter during a flash flood. The stand of cottonwoods that marked the old stage route. The dried creek bed where he'd found a lost child years ago and carried her home to tearful, grateful parents. Each landmark brought memories, most of them bittersweet. As Redemption Springs came into view, Eli's heart hammered with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Anxiety, certainly, but also something like hope. These people had believed in him enough to help him when he needed it. Sarah had given him supplies. Tom had lent him a horse. The sheriff had warned him of danger without trying to stop him from taking the risk. They'd treated him with dignity he hadn't felt he deserved. And now he was returning, bringing with him the danger of Cross's bounty. Any man who helped him, who even spoke with him, could become a target. Was he being selfish coming back here? Should he have stayed away, protected them by his absence? But Asher moved forward steadily, as if the decision was already made. And perhaps it was. Eli couldn't build a new life by running from everyone who'd shown him kindness. He had to trust that the people of Redemption Springs were strong enough, wise enough, to make their own choices about the risks they'd accept. They arrived at sunset, the town bathed in golden light that softened its rough edges. A few people on the street recognized him, and word spread quickly. By the time he reached the stable, a small crowd had gathered. Tom Haskins pushed through, his weathered face showing both relief and concern. "Eli Thorne, I'll be damned. We heard stories, but nobody knew if they were true." Tom looked at Asher with open admiration. "And look at this magnificent creature. This the horse that carried you to Fort Halloran? This is Asher. He found me when I was dying in the desert and saved my life." Eli dismounted slowly, his legs stiff from the long ride. "I'm sorry about Bess, Tom. She gave everything she had, but the desert was too much for her." "Bess was old," Tom said, though sadness flickered in his eyes. "She went doing something that mattered. Can't ask for more than that." He stepped forward and shook Eli's hand firmly. "You did good, Eli, real good. The whole territory is talking about what you did." Sarah Brennan appeared, pushing through the crowd with the determination of a woman who wouldn't be denied. She stopped in front of Eli, her eyes bright with emotion. For a moment she said nothing, just looked at him as if confirming he was real. Then she stepped forward and embraced him, not caring who saw or what they thought. "You foolish, brave, wonderful man," she said against his shoulder. "I thought you were dead. When we heard what happened, about the desert crossing and the gunfight at the rocks, I thought I'd never see you again." "I had help," Eli said, his voice rough. "More help than I deserved." She pulled back, studying his face. "You look different." "Thinner, certainly. More weathered. But there's something else. Something in your eyes." "I found something I'd lost," Eli said simply. "Or maybe it found me." Sheriff Clayton made his way through the crowd, his expression serious. "Eli, we need to talk. Privately." They moved into the stable office, away from curious ears. The sheriff closed the door and leaned against it, his arms crossed. "Vernon Cross put a bounty on you. $5,000. Every gunslinger and bounty hunter west of the Mississippi knows about it by now." "I know. Commander Price told me." "Then why come back here? You're putting this whole town at risk. Would you rather I'd stayed away? Never thanked the people who helped me? Never told you what happened to Samuel Webb's message?" Eli met the sheriff's eyes steadily. "I won't put anyone in danger who doesn't choose it. If you want me to leave, I'll go. But I needed to come back first. I needed to face what I'd started." Clayton studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "You've changed, Eli. A month ago you would have run. You would have taken the easy path and told yourself it was for everyone's good." He straightened. "All right, you can stay, but we do this smart. No advertising your presence. Keep a low profile. And if trouble comes, you let me handle it. That's what I'm paid for. Agreed. Good, now get some rest. You look like death warmed over. The sheriff's stern expression softened slightly. It's good to have you back, Eli, even if you are a magnet for trouble. Eli settled back into life in Redemption Springs, though nothing felt quite the same as before. Sarah gave him work at the general store, paying him fairly for honest labor. Tom let him continue sleeping in the stable, though Eli spent most evenings with Asher, talking to the Stallion as if he were an old friend rather than an animal, because that's what Asher had become. More than a horse, more than a companion. Something Eli couldn't quite define, but felt in his bones. The fourth night after his return, Eli woke to find moonlight streaming through the stable's high window, painting everything in silver and shadow. He sat up on his bedroll, drawn by an instinct he didn't question. Asher stood in his stall, illuminated by that pale light, and something was different. Eli approached slowly, his heart beating faster. The stallion's white coat seemed to shimmer, not reflecting light but generating it. The air around Asher hummed with energy, making the hair on Eli's arms stand up. And the ancient bridle, the one Eli had found in the desert, glowed with faint symbols that pulsed like a heartbeat. "What are you?" Eli whispered. Asher turned to face him fully. For a moment, just a heartbeat, the stallion's form wavered. Eli saw, or thought he saw, the outline of something else. Not quite human, but not quite animal either. Something in between, something ancient and powerful and impossibly kind. Then the moment passed, and Asher was just a horse again. But Eli knew what he'd seen, knew it with the same certainty he knew his own name. His hands trembling, Eli reached out and touched the bridle. The leather was warm beneath his fingers, almost alive. The symbols carved into it weren't decoration. They were words, a language older than any he knew, and somehow, impossibly, he could read them. "Spirit guide," he breathed. "Guardian of lost souls. You appear to those at the crossroads between death and purpose." Memories flooded back. Stories his father had told him, legends passed down from the indigenous peoples who'd lived on this land for centuries before white settlers arrived. Tales of sacred horses that appeared in times of great need, guiding the lost back to their path. Eli had dismissed them as superstition, the kind of folklore that didn't survive contact with the harsh realities of frontier life. But he'd been wrong. Those stories weren't superstition. They were history, preserved in the oral traditions of people who understood things that Eli's rational mind had refused to accept. He pulled the turquoise pendant from his pocket, the one he'd found in Asher's mane during their journey. In the moonlight, it too seemed to glow, its blue-green surface marked with symbols that matched those on the bridle. He held it up, studying it with new eyes. "You didn't just happen to find me," Eli said, understanding washing over him. "You were sent. Or you came because something in the universe knew I was needed, knew that Samuel's message had to reach Fort Halloran, and I was the only one who could carry it." Asher lowered his head, pressing his forehead to Eli's chest. The gesture confirmed everything Eli had guessed. Yes, you were dying, but your purpose wasn't finished. You had one more mission to complete, one more chance to be the man you were meant to be. "But why me?" Eli's voice cracked. "Why not someone younger, stronger, better? Why choose a broken-down old drunk who'd failed at everything that mattered?" The answer came not in words, but in feeling, flowing through the connection between them. Because broken things, once mended, are stronger than they were before. Because a man who's failed understands the cost of failure and will fight harder to succeed. Because sometimes the universe needs someone who has nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Tears ran down Eli's weathered face. All his life he'd felt like he was stumbling through darkness, never quite finding his way, never quite understanding his purpose. But Asher had shown him that even his failures had meaning. Even his darkest years had been leading him to this moment, preparing him for this mission. "What happens now?" Eli asked. "Your purpose is fulfilled. The message was delivered. Those families are safe. Does that mean you'll leave?" Asher pulled back, and in his deep eyes, Eli saw layers of meaning he was only beginning to understand. The immediate mission was complete, yes, But Eli's journey wasn't over. There was more work to do, more healing to achieve, more chances to become the man he was meant to be. "You're not leaving," Eli said, relief flooding through him. "Not yet." The stallion nickered softly, and Eli felt the confirmation. "Not yet. Not until your story is complete." Eli spent the next day in a state of wonder and confusion, seeing everything through new eyes. Every moment with Asher during their journey took on new meaning. The stallion hadn't just been leading him to water or away from danger. He'd been guiding Eli through a spiritual journey disguised as a physical one. The ghost town of Silver Peak hadn't been a random stop. Asher had taken him there deliberately, forcing him to confront his guilt over his friend's death, helping him understand that forgiveness started with forgiving himself. The hidden oasis where they'd found water and rest hadn't been luck. It had been chosen specifically, a place where Eli could recover not just his body, but his sense of worth. Even the confrontation with Cross's men had served a purpose beyond simple survival. Eli had been forced to defend himself, to fight for something beyond his own life, to remember that he was capable of courage when it mattered. "You've been teaching me," Eli said that evening, standing in Asher's stall with his hand on the stallion's neck. "Every step of the journey, every challenge, every moment of doubt. You weren't just helping me deliver a message. You were helping me find myself." Asher's response was a soft nicker and a gentle pressure of his head against Eli's shoulder. The confirmation was clear, and with it came a deeper understanding. The journey hadn't ended at Fort Halloran. Returning to Redemption Springs was part of it. Facing the consequences of his actions, rebuilding relationships, learning to live with purpose instead of merely surviving. All of it was part of Asher's guidance. But there was more coming. Eli could feel it in the way Asher sometimes stood alert, ears pricked toward the horizon. In the way the stallion's muscles would tense, as if preparing for something. The immediate mission was complete, but the greater purpose wasn't finished. That night Eli dreamed, not the confused, fragmented dreams of normal sleep, but something clearer, more vivid. He saw himself standing on a high ridge, looking down at Redemption Springs. The town was peaceful in golden sunlight, people going about their daily lives, unaware of approaching danger. Then he saw riders coming from the east. Not just a few, but many, armed men converging on the town with clear intent. At their head rode a man whose face he couldn't quite see, but whose presence radiated anger and determination. Eli woke with a gasp, his heart racing. The dream had felt more like a vision than imagination, more like warning than fear. He sat up and found Asher standing at the stable entrance, silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky, his attention fixed on the eastern horizon. "You see them too," Eli said, understanding flooding through him. "They're coming." "Cross's men?" "Maybe Cross himself if he managed to post bail." "They're coming for me, and they won't care who gets in their way." The pieces fell into place with terrible clarity. This was why Asher had stayed, not just to help Eli find himself, but to prepare him for what was coming. The journey through the desert had been training, learning to survive impossible odds, learning to trust in guidance beyond his own limited understanding, learning that he was capable of more than he'd believed. Everything had been leading to this moment. The spiritual awakening, the recovered sense of purpose, the reconnection with people who cared about him. Eli had needed all of it to be ready for what was coming. Asher had known from the beginning that delivering Samuel's message would trigger retaliation, had known that Cross would come after Eli with everything he had. But this time, Eli wouldn't be alone in the desert dying and desperate. This time, he'd have Asher at his side. He'd have friends who believed in him. He'd have the strength that came from knowing his life had meaning, that what he did mattered.
"How long?"
Eli asked quietly. "How long until they arrive?" Asher turned to look at him, and Eli read the answer in those ancient knowing eyes. "Soon, very soon. Days at most." "Then we'd better prepare," Eli said, standing and moving to Asher's side. "If they're coming for a fight, we'll give them one. But on our terms, not theirs." He placed his hand on the turquoise pendant that now hung around his neck, feeling its warmth against his skin. Spirit guide, guardian, friend. Whatever Asher truly was, Eli was grateful beyond words that this magnificent being had chosen to walk beside him. Together, they watched the sun rise over Redemption Springs, knowing that the peace of this moment wouldn't last much longer. Eli went to Sheriff Clayton immediately after dawn. The lawman listened to his concerns with growing gravity, not dismissing the dream as mere imagination. Clayton had been on the frontier long enough to respect instincts that couldn't be easily explained. "If they're coming in force, we need to prepare," Clayton said, pulling out a map of the town and surrounding area. Redemption Springs wasn't built as a fort. We've got maybe 20 men who can handle a rifle, including shopkeepers and farmers. Against professional gunmen, those odds aren't good. "We don't have to win a pitched battle," Eli said, studying the map. "We just need to make it costly enough that they give up and leave. Cross wants revenge, but his men want to live. If we can hurt them badly enough in the first engagement, they might decide $5,000 isn't worth dying for." Clayton nodded slowly. "We have some advantages. We know the town, they don't. We can fortify positions, set up crossfire points. If we're smart about it, we can make every street a killing ground." They spent the morning organizing defenses. Clayton quietly recruited men he trusted, explaining the situation without causing panic. Tom Haskins proved surprisingly tactical, suggesting ways to use the stable as a strong point. The blacksmith, a massive man named Jonas, began reinforcing doors and windows with iron bars. Sarah Brennan organized the women to prepare medical supplies and food stores. By afternoon, word had spread through the town despite their efforts at discretion. People had a right to know what was coming, what danger Eli's presence had brought to their doorstep. He expected anger, perhaps demands that he leave to protect them. Instead, he found resolve. "You did right by those settlers," Jonas said, his deep voice carrying across the gathered crowd in the church. "You carried that message when you could have just looked the other way. If Cross wants to punish you for doing the right thing, then he's punishing all of us who believe right matters more than profit. We stand with Eli," Sarah added, her quiet voice somehow commanding attention. "This is our town. We don't let bullies decide who belongs here and who doesn't." Others voiced agreement. Not everyone, certainly. A few families decided to leave for a while, seeking safety with relatives in other settlements. Eli didn't blame them. They had children to protect, lives to preserve. But most stayed, and those who stayed prepared to fight. That evening, Eli stood on the church roof with Clayton, watching the surrounding landscape as the sun set. From this vantage point, they could see for miles in every direction. Empty land for now, but somewhere out there, riders were coming. "Tell me about the horse," Clayton said after a long silence. "Tom says he's never seen anything like him. Says Asher doesn't behave like a normal animal." Eli considered how much to share, then decided the truth was simpler than evasion. "He's a spirit guide. Indigenous peoples have stories about horses like him, creatures that appear when someone is at a crossroads between death and purpose. I was dying in the desert and he found me. He's been guiding me ever since." Clayton absorbed this without visible skepticism. "My grandmother was Navajo. She told me stories about the spirit animals. Said they came when the world needed something to change, when one person's choice could shift the balance." He glanced at Eli. "You believe that's what this is? Your choice shifting some kind of balance?" "I think Samuel Webb's message needed to reach Fort Halloran, and I was the only one positioned to carry it. Everything else followed from that." Eli touched the turquoise pendant. "But now something else is happening. Cross is coming not just for revenge, but because he represents something. Greed over compassion, power over justice. If he wins, if he kills me and terrorizes this town, it sends a message that good men should stay quiet and let evil prosper. And if we win, then maybe it encourages others to stand up. Maybe it shows that ordinary people can still make a difference." Eli smiled without humor. "Or maybe I'm just an old man trying to make his last stand mean something. Either way we fight," Clayton said. "I've been sheriff here for 15 years. I've kept the peace, settled disputes, made sure people felt safe. I'm not about to let some cattle baron's hired killers change that. They descended from the roof as full darkness fell. Eli found Asher waiting for him at the stable, the stallion's presence calming his racing thoughts. He checked the ancient bridle, making sure it was secure, then ran his hands down Asher's legs, checking for any sign of injury or strain. "We've been through worse," Eli said softly to the stallion. "The desert nearly killed us both. Thirst, exhaustion, bullets. We survived all of it. We'll survive this too." Asher nickered in response, and Eli felt that familiar surge of confidence flow between them. Yes, together they could face whatever came. The second day of preparation brought a telegram from Fort Halloran. Commander Price had heard rumors of cross-posting bail and gathering men. He was sending a cavalry detachment, but they wouldn't arrive for at least 4 days. Maybe 5. Eli and Redemption Springs would have to hold out until then. 4 days, Sarah said, reading the telegram over Eli's shoulder. "We can manage 4 days. Against how many men, though?" Eli folded the telegram carefully. "Cross has money and connections. He could bring 20 fighters, 30. We're outnumbered no matter how you count it. Numbers aren't everything. You proved that in the desert, one man, against impossible odds." She touched his arm gently. "You're not alone this time, Eli. That makes you stronger, not weaker." He wanted to believe her. Wanted to think that community and righteousness would triumph over superior numbers and professional killers. But he'd seen enough of the frontier to know that good intentions didn't stop bullets. That afternoon, a rider arrived from the east. Not one of Cross's men, but a drifter who'd passed through a settlement 40 miles away. He brought news that sent cold dread through Eli's chest. "Saw them 2 days ago," the drifter said, accepting water from Sarah. "Maybe 25 riders, all armed heavy, led by Vernon Cross himself. He was asking about a town called Redemption Springs, asking if anyone knew the way. Offered gold for information." "How far behind you?" Clayton asked. "I rode hard to warn you. Maybe a day, day and a half if they're moving cautious." 25 men. Eli had hoped for fewer, though hope had been a fragile thing. Cross was bringing an army, and he was leading it himself. This wasn't just about bounty money anymore. This was personal revenge, and Cross would spare no expense to see it done. The town mobilized with renewed urgency. Barricades went up on the main approaches. Men took positions in upper windows with clear fields of fire. The church bell was rigged to ring at the first sign of riders, giving everyone time to reach their defensive positions. Eli spent the evening writing another letter to Margaret. If things went badly, if Cross's men overran the town, he wanted his daughter to know what had happened and why. He wanted her to understand that he died trying to be the man she deserved. As a father, even if he'd failed at that for most of her life. "Dear Margaret," he wrote by lamplight, "if you're reading this, it means I didn't survive what's coming. Vernon Cross, the man whose crimes I helped expose, is coming for revenge. I could run, could disappear into the territories where he'd never find me, but running would mean abandoning people who showed me kindness when I deserved none. It would mean being the same coward I was when I let whiskey destroy our family. I'm staying because that's what a man with honor does. He stands with his friends. He faces consequences. He fights for what's right, even when the odds are against him. I should have learned that lesson 20 years ago, but sometimes we come to wisdom late. If I survive this, I'll send you a different letter, one that asks if we might rebuild what I destroyed. But if I don't, I want you to know that my last thoughts will be of you, of the little girl who used to ride on my shoulders, of the young woman who deserved so much better than I gave her, of the daughter I loved even when I was too broken to show it properly. Be happy, Margaret. Build a good life with your husband, have children and raise them well, and maybe occasionally remember your father not as the drunk who failed you, but as the man who tried, at the very end, to be worthy of your name. With all my love, your father." He sealed the letter and gave it to Sarah for safekeeping. "If things go wrong, make sure this reaches Philadelphia." "Nothing will go wrong," she said firmly. "You're going to survive this, Eli Thorne. You're..." Going to reconcile with your daughter and live to be an old man who tells stories about the time he crossed the desert with a spirit horse. Bish, he smiled despite the weight in his chest. You have a lot of faith in a broken-down cowboy. I have faith in a good man who finally remembered who he is. She kissed his cheek quickly, surprising them both. Now get some rest. Tomorrow we make our stand. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Eli lay in the stable loft, listening to the sounds of a town preparing for war, hammers striking nails as barricades were reinforced, low voices discussing tactics and positions, the occasional nervous laugh that people made when facing their own mortality. He pulled out Samuel Webb's pocket watch, the one he'd carried during that desperate ride to Fort Halloran. The hands showed 3 o'clock in the morning, ticking steadily forward. Time moving toward whatever dawn would bring. Asher stood in his stall below, unnaturally alert. The Stallion hadn't slept since they'd returned to Redemption Springs, as if keeping vigil against the approaching danger. Eli climbed down from the loft and stood beside him, drawing comfort from the animal's steady presence. I'm scared, Eli admitted quietly. Not of dying. I made peace with that in the desert when I thought it was over. But I'm scared of failing these people. They're counting on me, and my whole life has been one failure after another. Asher turned his head, those deep eyes finding Eli's in the darkness. And once again, understanding flowed between them. Not words, but meaning. You've already succeeded. You delivered the message. You saved those families. Everything that comes after is simply living with courage, and courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. When will you leave? Eli asked. After this is done, assuming I survive, will you disappear like you appeared? Go back to wherever spirit guides go when their work is finished? The Stallion pressed his forehead to Eli's chest, and Eli felt the answer. When your story is complete, when you've learned what you needed to learn, when you're ready to continue without me, I'll never be ready for you to leave, Eli whispered. You're the best friend I've ever had. But he understood. Asher wasn't meant to stay forever. Spirit guides came for a purpose, and when that purpose was fulfilled, they moved on to help others who needed them. Eli would have to learn to carry forward what Asher had taught him, to be his own compass when the Stallion was gone. Dawn came grey and cold, with clouds obscuring the sun. Fitting weather for what was coming. Eli stood at the eastern edge of town, with Sheriff Clayton, both men scanning the horizon with spyglasses borrowed from the general store. There, Clayton said, his voice tight. Dust cloud, big one. Eli focused his glass on the distant movement. Riders, many of them, approaching at a steady pace. They weren't trying to hide their numbers or their intent. Cross wanted them to see, wanted them to feel the weight of what was coming. Ring the bell, Clayton said to the young deputy waiting nearby. Get everyone to their positions. The church bell pealed across Redemption Springs, its urgent tones shattering the morning quiet. People moved quickly to their assigned places. Windows shuttered, barricades manned, rifles checked and loaded. The town transformed from a peaceful settlement to a fortress in minutes. Eli mounted Asher, feeling the Stallion's power beneath him. They took up position in the center of town, visible to all, a deliberate statement. Here I am. Come and take your revenge if you dare. The riders approached slowly, spreading out as they neared the town. Eli counted 27 men, all heavily armed, their faces hard with the kind of determination that came from substantial payment. At their head rode Vernon Cross himself, a tall man in his 50s with cold eyes and a cruel mouth. Cross raised his hand, halting his men about 100 yards from the town's edge. He studied the barricades, the defenders in windows, the clear preparation for his arrival. Then his gaze found Eli, sitting calmly on Asher in the middle of Main Street. Eli Thorne, Cross called out, his voice carrying. I've come a long way for you, spent a lot of money, all because you couldn't mind your own business. It became my business when Samuel Webb died putting that message in my hands, Eli called back. It became my business when I learned what you were doing to innocent families. Noble words from a drunk who couldn't even keep his own family together. Cross's smile was vicious. I know all about you, Thorn. Your failures, your weakness. You're nothing but a washed-up old man playing hero. It's pathetic. Maybe so, Eli agreed calmly. But this pathetic old man got your evidence to Fort Halloran, and that's cost you everything, hasn't it? Your reputation, your empire, your freedom. That must sting. Cross's face darkened with rage. You want me? Eli said, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his gut. Then come and get me. But these people have done nothing to you. They're not part of this fight. They chose to be part of it when they sheltered you, Cross shot back. When they helped you prepare for my arrival, they made their choice. Now they'll live with the consequences. Or you could take your men and ride away. Live to fight your legal battles another day. You're not a killer, Cross. You're a businessman. This isn't worth dying for. Cross laughed, harsh and cold. I'm not the one who's going to die today. He raised his hand. Take the town, kill anyone who resists, and bring me Eli Thorn's head. The riders spurred forward with a roar, splitting into 3 groups to attack from multiple directions. Eli had expected this. They'd prepared for it, but knowing what was coming and facing it were 2 different things. The first volley of gunfire erupted from the defenders. 3 riders fell immediately, caught in the crossfire from fortified positions. The attack faltered for a moment as the riders realized this wouldn't be easy. Then they pressed forward again, returning fire, their bullets chipping wood and shattering glass. Eli kicked Asher into motion, racing toward the eastern barricade where the attack was heaviest. He fired his Navy Colt as he rode, more to draw attention than with real hope of hitting anything. His role wasn't to kill Cross's men. It was to be visible, to be the target, to draw fire away from the townspeople. A bullet passed so close to his ear he felt its heat. Another struck Asher's flank, or should have, but somehow missed by inches. The Stallion moved with impossible agility, weaving between obstacles, anticipating danger before it materialized. This was what Asher truly was, Eli realized. Not just a guide for his soul, but a protector of his flesh. One of Cross's men broke through the barricade, his horse leaping over stacked crates. He aimed at Eli point blank, his finger tightening on the trigger. But Asher reared, his hooves striking the man's chest with devastating force, sending him tumbling backward. The shot went wild, harmless. The battle raged through the streets, gunfire echoing off buildings, men shouting and cursing. The defenders held their positions, making Cross's men pay for every foot of ground. But the attackers had numbers and experience. They advanced methodically, using cover, coordinating their movements. Jonas the blacksmith fell, a bullet in his shoulder. Tom Haskins took a graze across his ribs, but stayed at his post, still firing. The young deputy went down, his leg shattered, and had to be dragged to safety by 2 shopkeepers. Eli's world narrowed to survival. Reload, fire, move, reload again. Asher beneath him, moving with that supernatural awareness, keeping them alive through skill that transcended normal animal instinct. They became a blur of motion, appearing where they were needed, disrupting attacks, preventing breakthroughs. But they couldn't be everywhere at once. Cross himself stayed back, directing his men, watching the battle with cold calculation. He'd hired professionals, and they worked together with military precision. They concentrated fire on defensive positions, suppressing the defenders while others advanced. Slowly, methodically, they pushed into the town. The western barricade fell, overwhelmed by concentrated assault. 5 of Cross's men poured through, fanning out to flank the remaining defenders. Sheriff Clayton saw the danger and moved to intercept, but he was pinned down by heavy fire. Eli wheeled Asher around, racing toward the breakthrough. If those 5 men got behind the main defensive line, the battle would be over in minutes. The townspeople would be slaughtered. He reached them as they were moving between buildings, thinking themselves safe from the defenders' guns. Eli fired twice, dropping one man, wounding another. The remaining three turned on him, their faces twisted with rage and determination. 3 against 1, at close range. Even with Asher's help, the odds were terrible. But then Sarah appeared from a doorway, a shotgun in her hands. She fired both barrels, the massive blast catching one attacker full in the chest. The man went down hard, dead before he hit the ground. Tom Haskins came from the other direction, his rifle cracking twice in quick succession. Another attacker fell, clutching his legs, screaming. The last man standing threw down his gun and raised his hands. "I surrender." "Don't shoot." Eli could hear the fear in the man's voice, see it in his eyes. This was just a job to him, and the pay wasn't worth dying for. "Get out of here," Eli said. "Run and don't come back." The man ran. But the reprieve was temporary. Cross's remaining forces regrouped, their attack becoming more focused, more desperate. They'd lost nearly a third of their men, and those who remained were fighting with the fury of people who knew they were committed too deeply to retreat. Vernon Cross himself finally entered the battle, his expensive rifle in hand. He moved with military precision, clearly a man who'd seen combat before building his cattle empire. He positioned himself with clear sight lines, picking off defenders with methodical accuracy. Sheriff Clayton took a bullet in the arm. One of the shopkeepers went down, unconscious from a head wound. The defenders were tiring, ammunition running low, injuries mounting. They'd inflicted terrible casualties on Cross's men, but they were ordinary citizens facing professional fighters. Courage could only carry them so far. Eli saw all this from Asher's back, saw the battle turning against them despite their best efforts. The cavalry wouldn't arrive for 3 more days. They had to hold until then, but at this rate there wouldn't be anyone left to hold. He made a decision, the only decision that made sense. "I'm going after Cross," he told Asher. "If I can take him down, his men might lose heart. They're not fighting for a cause. They're fighting for his money. No Cross, no reason to keep dying." Asher turned without hesitation, heading toward where Cross had taken position behind a water trough, using it for cover while he reloaded. The stallion moved with purpose, with that supernatural awareness that had saved Eli's life a dozen times already. Cross saw them coming and smiled. This was what he'd wanted all along. Not a siege, not a massacre, but personal confrontation. He wanted to kill Eli Thorne with his own hands, wanted to look into the eyes of the man who'd ruined him and watch the light go out. He stood from cover, rifle raised, aiming carefully. Time seemed to slow. Eli saw Cross's finger tighten on the trigger, saw the barrel lined up with his chest, knew the shot would be fatal. But Asher surged forward with impossible speed, and the shot went wide. They closed the distance before Cross could chamber another round. Eli threw himself from the saddle, tackling Cross to the ground. The rifle went flying, skittering across the dirt street. They grappled in the dust, 2 older men fighting with desperate strength. Cross was larger, had more weight to throw around. But Eli had spent the past weeks crossing deserts, fighting for survival, rediscovering muscles he'd forgotten he possessed. And he was fighting for more than revenge. He was fighting for the people of Redemption Springs, for Sarah's kindness and Tom's trust, for the chance to prove he could be the man his father raised him to be. Cross got his hands around Eli's throat, squeezing with murderous intent. Stars burst in Eli's vision as oxygen was cut off. He clawed at Cross's hands, trying to break the grip, but the man was strong, driven by hate that gave him terrible power. Then Asher was there, his teeth closing on Cross's collar, yanking the man backward with strength that seemed impossible for a horse. Cross's grip broke, and Eli gasped in air, his vision clearing. Cross scrambled for his dropped rifle, but Eli was faster. He kicked it away, then drew his Navy Colt, leveling it at Cross's head. His hand was steady, his breathing was calm. One pull of the trigger, and Vernon Cross would be dead, the threat eliminated, the battle likely ended. "Do it," Cross snarled. "Pull the trigger. Prove you're just as much a killer as anyone else." Eli's finger rested on the trigger. It would be so easy, so justified. This man had tried to steal from innocent families, had put a bounty on Eli's head, had brought an army to murder everyone Eli cared about. The world would be better without Vernon Cross in it. But Sarah's words echoed in his mind. "You're a good man. Don't let anyone tell you different. Not even yourself." "No," Eli said quietly. "You don't get to make me into what you are. You don't get to corrupt what I've become." He holstered his revolver and instead drove his fist into Cross's jaw, a solid punch that dropped the cattle baron to the ground, unconscious but alive. Behind him, the sounds of battle were changing. Cross's men had seen their leader fall. They were breaking, retreating, some throwing down their weapons in surrender. Sheriff Clayton appeared, his wounded arm bound tight, his other hand holding a rifle. "It's over," he said, looking at the chaos in the streets. "They're surrendering or running." "We held them." The cost was visible everywhere Eli looked. Buildings damaged by bullets, bodies in the street, both attackers and defenders, wounded men crying for help, the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging in the air like a shroud. "We held them," Eli repeated, the words hollow. "But at what cost?" He moved through the aftermath in a daze, helping where he could. Tom Haskins had a nasty wound but would survive. Jonas the blacksmith was being carried to the doctor's office, his shoulder bleeding heavily, but the bullet having missed vital arteries. The young deputy's leg was shattered, but he was alive, gritting his teeth against the pain. 3 defenders were dead, good men who'd stood their ground defending their town. Eli knew their names, knew their families. One had a wife pregnant with their first child. Another had 3 young sons. The third had been planning to open a new shop next spring. They died because Eli had come back to Redemption Springs. Died because he'd brought Vernon Cross's wrath down upon them. The weight of that settled on his shoulders like a physical burden. Sarah found him sitting on the church steps, his head in his hands. She was covered in blood and dust, exhausted from tending the wounded, but her eyes were clear and fierce. "Don't you dare," she said. "Don't you dare take this on yourself. Those men chose to fight. They chose to stand for what was right. You gave them that choice, and they made it freely. They're dead because of me. They're dead because Vernon Cross is a monster who couldn't accept that he lost. They're dead because evil men exist in this world, and sometimes good men have to stand against them." She sat beside him, her hand finding his. "And they're dead as heroes, Eli. They saved their town. They protected their families. They stood with a friend when he needed them. There's honor in that." Eli wanted to believe her, wanted to accept that their deaths had meaning, that the cost had been worth it. But grief and guilt were powerful forces, and they warred with his attempts at reason. Asher appeared, moving through the chaos of the aftermath with uncanny grace. He came straight to Eli, pressing his head against his chest in that familiar gesture of comfort and connection. And through that touch, Eli felt something shift inside him. Understanding flowed from the stallion, wordless but profound. This was the nature of standing for something. Sometimes people died. Sometimes the cost was high. But the alternative, letting evil triumph through inaction, that cost was higher still. Those 3 men had made the world a little better by their sacrifice. Their deaths weren't meaningless. They were the price of keeping the darkness at bay. "Thank you," Eli whispered to Asher, "for everything. For saving me in the desert. For guiding me here. For showing me that I could still be worth something." The stallion pulled back, and Eli looked into those deep, ancient eyes. Something was different. The urgency, the driving purpose that had characterized their relationship, was fading, being replaced by something gentler, more like farewell than continuation. "You're leaving," Eli said, understanding washing over him. "Your work here is done." Asher nickered softly, and Eli felt the confirmation. "Yes, you've learned what you needed to learn. You've become who you needed to become. You don't need me anymore. I'll always need you." But even as he said it, Eli knew it wasn't true. He had friends now, real connections with people who valued him. He had purpose beyond mere survival. He had proven to himself that he could stand for something, fight for something, be someone worth being. Asher had given him all those things, but now Eli had to carry them forward on his own. The cavalry arrived late that afternoon, too late for the battle, but in time to take custody of Vernon Cross and his surviving men. The commander, a young lieutenant named Peterson, looked around at the damaged town and the wounded defenders with something like awe. "You held against 27 armed men, with mostly shopkeepers and farmers?" he asked Sheriff Clayton. "We had Eli Thorne," Clayton said simply, "and he had something special on his side." Peterson looked at Eli, then at Asher standing nearby. "The White Stallion. We heard stories about him at the fort. Some of the men swear he's not entirely natural." "He's not," Eli agreed. "He's a gift, a second chance, a reminder that sometimes, when we need it most, help comes from unexpected places." As night fell over Redemption Springs, Eli stood in the stable with Asher one final time. The morning after the battle dawned clear and bright, as if the sky itself wanted to wash away the violence of the previous day. Eli woke early and went to the stable, knowing what he would find but needing to see it for himself. Asher's stall was empty. The ancient bridle hung on a hook, its leather no longer warm with mysterious energy, its symbols no longer glowing. The turquoise pendant lay on the straw, its purpose fulfilled. Eli picked it up, holding it to the light, seeing it now as simply a beautiful stone rather than a talisman of mystical power. The stallion was gone, returned to wherever spirit guides went when their work was finished. Eli felt the absence like a physical ache, but beneath the grief was gratitude. Asher had saved his life, saved his soul, and shown him that redemption was possible even for men who'd failed as completely as Eli had. 2 weeks passed. The town healed, rebuilding damaged structures, tending wounded men, mourning their dead with quiet dignity. Vernon Cross was transported to a territorial prison to await trial. His men scattered, those who survived taking their stories of the battle with them. The tale spread across the frontier, growing with each telling, until Eli Thorne became something of a legend. The old cowboy who'd crossed the desert to deliver a message and then defended his town against impossible odds. Eli didn't feel like a legend. He felt like a man who'd been given a second chance and barely managed not to waste it. On a Tuesday morning, the telegraph operator came running to the general store where Eli was stacking crates. "Message for you, Mr. Thorne, from Philadelphia." Eli's hands trembled as he unfolded the telegram. Margaret's words were brief, but they hit him harder than any bullet. "Father, received your letter. Would like to talk. Coming west in 3 weeks. Will meet you in Redemption Springs. Margaret." He read it 3 times, making sure he understood correctly. His daughter was coming. After 6 years of silence, she was willing to see him, to talk, to perhaps begin healing what he'd broken. Sarah found him sitting on a crate, tears streaming down his weathered face. She read the telegram over his shoulder and smiled. "See? Good things do happen to good men. I don't deserve this. Maybe not. But you're getting it anyway. That's called grace, Eli. Learn to accept it." 3 weeks later, Eli stood on the station platform as the stage from the east arrived. His new compass, the one Commander Price had given him, rested in his pocket, pointing true north. Pointing toward home and hope and second chances. A woman stepped down from the stage, tall and elegant in her Eastern dress, her face so like her mother's that Eli's breath caught. But her eyes, those were his eyes, and as they met his gaze, he saw not forgiveness exactly, but willingness. Willingness to try, to listen, to see if something broken could be mended. "Hello, Father," Margaret said, her voice careful but not cold. "Hello, Margaret. Thank you for coming." They stood there awkwardly, 2 people separated by years and pain, searching for a way to bridge the gap. Then Margaret stepped forward and embraced him, brief but genuine, and Eli felt something break open in his chest. "I can't promise anything," she said, "but I'm here. That's a start." "It's more than I hoped for," Eli replied. "More than I deserve." As they walked together toward the town, Eli glanced back at the horizon. For just a moment, he thought he saw a white stallion standing on a distant ridge, silhouetted against the sky. Then he blinked, and it was gone. But the message was clear. Your story isn't over. Keep walking forward. Keep being the man you've become. Eli Thorne smiled, took his daughter's arm, and walked toward whatever future awaited him. He wasn't afraid anymore. Whatever came next, he would face it with the courage Asher had helped him rediscover. That was enough. That was everything.